Namaste, y'all. Namaste. My name is Becca Cummings. Welcome to my office. I'm coming to you live from Austin, Texas today, and I wanted to hop on and talk about our shadow behaviors. As it turns out, your shadow behaviors and your struggles are actually a blessing because the things that we're ashamed of, the things that we struggle with, are usually a symptom of something else. So let me give you an example. I used to study dinosaurs, and I used to actually study dinosaur injuries and diseases. And so you can have, let me just grab this. You can have evidence of disease in fossils. And most of what we studied were injuries, some trauma. They had a lot of trauma that got recorded in their fossil bones, but we did see some other infectious diseases and things like that. And what we're looking at when we're studying fossil diseases or fossil injuries is we're looking at a record of the trauma. We're looking at the wound. And that wound, the characteristics of it on the bone, give us clues to what the source of that was, what the origin of that was. So just to give you an example, we have Allosaurus fragilis here. And in the foot of this dinosaur, one individual had a super infected foot bone. So normally the bone, and this is just a copy of the bone, it's not the real bone. Normally the bone is this wide, but it was all infected. It was broken and infected, and the joint surface has this big gaping hole where stuff was oozing out of it. So we reconstructed based on what we saw in the bone what happened to this animal when it was alive. It injured its foot and lived with the injury long enough for the bone to produce a record, and it got infected. So it was really like it would be this awful weeping sore on its foot. So we can do the same sort of detective work with ourselves. Okay. And what's cool with ourselves is we have a lot more information available. We don't just have our bones, we have the soft tissues as well. And so this is really amazing because you can use your symptoms to diagnose what's going on under the surface. Okay, so your shadow behaviors, for me, it was addiction, so self-sabotage through substance abuse, alcohol, marijuana, things like that. That was just a symptom of something indicating something else was going on. And it was telling me, it was showing me that I was operating from my shadow instead of from my power, my light. And I distinctly remember the moment when I stepped onto the self-development, personal awakening path. And it was the afternoon in the winter in Montana. And I had been working some that day. I worked out of my home and did field work in paleontology, but I was in the winter, it was report writing season. And I just remember I'd taken a few hits of marijuana. I hadn't drank anything yet because it was too early in the afternoon, but I just remember laying down on the living room floor and thinking to myself, my aura feels gray. Like I felt like I was just surrounded by this cloud of hazy gray. And I felt in that moment very aspiritual. That's the word that came to mind. It's like, that was it. I'm so aspiritual. I'm so disconnected. And what led up to that was a lot of different things, but that was like the culmination. That was like my wake up, my first waking up to the fact that I was in spiritual crisis. I needed to do something here. I was feeling isolated. I was living in a rural area. I was working alone. There was a severe lack of communication in my marriage. I was estranged from religion because it was so judgmental. I was, as I mentioned, abusing alcohol and marijuana. Um, I had a pattern of not being able to love myself. So I acquired my self love through other people, which isn't even self love, I guess. But so through people pleasing, through relationships, looking for love in all the wrong places, codependency. And as I stepped onto this path of awakening, or fell down onto the living floor, onto the path of awakening, um, I became aware of my disconnect, right? And through that awareness, I was able to start taking steps to change. So I started my self development journey, and things actually got a lot worse before they got better, like a lot worse. I got severely depressed. I went through suicidal time where I was thinking about suicide a lot, and then I actually had a suicidal attempt. Then things got better, but then I had cancer and some other issues come up. Then things got better, and anyway, my primary relationship, I decided I needed to let go of that, changed a lot of things. And, so things would get better and then plateau or get worse. That's kind of the path of personal development, it seems, is some ups, some plateaus, sometimes some descents. But generally, my trajectory has been upward. And it was really through consistent practice of yoga, developing myself spiritually through yoga, through the oneness and the unity and the connection I felt when I practiced yoga and did the breath work and meditated. And this brought me to a place of starting to reconnect with unconditional love, starting to forgive myself for all the wrongs I had done, all the judgment of myself, and starting to work towards self acceptance and self love. And that was new for me because I had gotten disconnected from myself and I didn't even know how to love myself. I would just find it through other people, through their admiration or attention. And in that, I ended up journeying back in towards self with with a capital S is the best way to describe it. So towards myself, but not the self of the ego mind. Self with a capital S, my higher self, my connection to the divine. I had a real hard problem for many, many years with the G word, with God, but great spirit, source, the connector, the creator, which I think of as love, the fabric of the universe and the connector of all things to me is love, unconditional love. And that basically is my religion. It's my spiritual practice is unconditional love, unconditional forgiveness. And so this last fall, I actually made a choice I've always felt a strong connection to Jesus Christ. And so I made a decision to go ahead and get baptized. And really, for me, the baptism was a way of washing myself clean of all the self judgments I had placed on myself and all the hardships I'd created for myself, and stepping into unconditional love at the level of Jesus Christ consciousness. So it was my way of ritualistically aligning with Christ consciousness. And so I was baptized in Costa Rica by my good friend Jonathan England. And I love this picture of my brother who passed away a few years back, Benj, because it's his Jesus picture. So I like to, when I meditate, I imagine I've got Jesus on one side and Benj on the other, helping me out. I tell you all this to just demonstrate the journey I've been on. I felt so disconnected, so isolated, so aspiritual. And over the course of 14 years, I started on the path and I kept walking the path and getting closer and closer to myself and closer into connection with the divine. And I really was able to learn a lot from my shadow behaviors by going to the source of them. So when you find a weed in the garden, you don't just want to break it off. You want to dig down in there and get the root. And the root for me of a lot of my self-sabotage, addiction, people-pleasing, codependency was actually a rupture in my connection to my spirit and my higher self. So the work I do now, I spent over 20 years digging dinosaurs and interpreting the fossil record, and the fossil record being a record of the history of the earth. And it's incomplete, right? Because we have mountain building, we have erosion. Sometimes some of the animals get buried and other ones don't. So you have an incomplete record, but you still piece together a story of what happened, the history of the earth. But now I tap into the Akashic Record to help people connect with themselves at a soul level. And the Akashic Record is an energetic record of the past. It's also kind of a record of patterns projecting into the future. So, but it's, mainly past thoughts, words, and actions of your soul in this life and past lives. And through that, by going into the Akashic Records and gathering information about your soul, I can help you better understand your shadow behaviors, which are on one side of the coin, and your light behaviors on the other side of the coin. They're related, right? So the shadow behaviors maybe are at the surface, and if we dig down, we can find the root of those shadow behaviors, which also has an element of light to them. So if you've been operating in your shadow and are interested in operating from your power, your gifts, this is a really great tool, is getting an Akashic Records reading and getting some guidance there. So I specifically help women who are in cycles of self-sabotage or healing from addictive cycles. And I help them connect to their own inner knowing and align with their divine gifts. And I do this through the Akashic Records, through the readings and the guidance. And it's something that's really changed my life. I'm a natural space holder. I'm very accepting and open, non-judgmental presence. And then I also have a heightened connection to my inner knowing. And because of that, I'm able to facilitate others' connection to their inner knowing and their gifts. So if this is something that's of interest to you, if you want to learn a little bit more about your soul's journey, your shadow behaviors, your natural gifts, I encourage you to get in touch with me, drop me a comment on this video, or send me a message. And I do offer free insight sessions. I do have a few of those available, not a lot, but I do have a few. And I'd love to hear about your journey, your spiritual connection, and how you see the world. So thank you everyone for listening to my my mess to message, my journey from aspiritual to spiritual AF. Namaste, y'all.